Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has today used an Eid speech to hit out at Israel following their bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus 10 days ago.
The wicked Zionist regime made another mistake and staged an attack on Iran's consulate, which means an attack on the country's soil, a violation of international norm. It made a mistake, and the regime needs to be punished and will be punished.
Israel's Foreign Minister Israel Katz has responded with a message posted on Twitter in both Hebrew and Farsi. So the message said this: if Iran attacks from its territory, Israel will react and attack in Iran. And then he's atted the Ayatollah Khamenei. I love sort of diplomacy done by sort of atting people on Twitter. Earlier today, I spoke to Trita Parsi, Vice President of the Quincy Institute and a world-leading expert on Israel-Iran relations. I began by asking him what we should make of this latest war of words.
I think two critical things comes out of this. First of all, Khamenei has now himself said that the attack on the consulate is tantamount to an attack on Iranian soil, and as a result, there will be an Iranian response. Now, that still doesn't mean that they will do something next week, or the magnitude or the scale of it. He did not say much about that. But he confirmed that this is viewed and treated by Iran as an attack on Iranian soil, which then is a violation of Iran's very clear red line, which the Israelis knew about. Secondly, you have this other interesting statement by the Israeli foreign minister in Hebrew and in Persian on Twitter, in which he says that an attack by Iran from Iran will be responded to by Israel with an attack on Iran. Now, here's where this is interesting. The Iranians don't have the capacity of flying fighter jets to attack Israel from Iranian soil. They do have extensive ballistic missiles capabilities with tremendous accuracy that they would fire on Israel in this scenario, most likely, or in a combination perhaps with a drone attack. It seems like the Israelis are signaling the Iranians that if Iran goes to that extent and uses ballistic missiles, then Israel will have no choice but to respond by doing an attack on Iranian soil, which could be against military facilities, it could be against the nuclear facilities, which of course would further escalate matters. The question then is, does the Israeli foreign minister by that signal that if there is an attack by Iranian proxies, allies, partners, whatever word you want to use to describe them, on Israel in response to what the Israelis did in Damascus, meaning it wouldn't be ballistic missiles, but it would be drones and things of that nature, that in that scenario, the Israelis would not escalate further by doing another attack on Iranian soil. It's not entirely clear if that is what it was meant, but if it is what it was meant, it may offer a potential way for the Iranians to respond without necessarily eliciting an Israeli attack on Iranian soil proper, which then would bring us probably deep into a regional war.
It does seem somewhat strange, this statement from the Israeli foreign minister, because the concern with where the weapons come from, not where they end up, might seem a bit surprising, because I suppose you could read into that, well, what if there's a ballistic missile from Iranian soil, but it lands somewhere outside of Israel, say, an Israeli consulate somewhere? Where would that fall within this matrix?
It seems like the message he was saying, again, this is a tweet with essentially just one sentence, suggests that what they are putting as a red line is that the attack actually would be a ballistic missile. Because that's what it really means, that it's saying that it would be an attack from Iranian soil. That's the only capacity the Iranians essentially have to do an attack from their own soil. And that's the Israeli red line. If it is a smaller attack with drones, other things may still, constitute a lot of damage on Israel. That is something that would get a lesser response, if any major response at all, from the Israelis. Now, that is what has been said publicly. We do not know what the messaging has been privately, and there have been messages exchanged between the Iranians and the Israelis over the course of the last 40 plus years in which they officially have had no communication. So we don't know what's been said privately about this. If that message is more clear, perhaps even contradictory, I think it should be noteworthy that this is a statement coming from the foreign minister, not the defense minister in Israel.
We're 10 days on from that sort of initial attack in Damascus on the Iranian consulate. Are we any clearer what that was about? Why did the Israelis think it was worth taking that risk towards escalation? Were they actually looking for escalation, or did they just think that the military target in that consulate was of such high value that it was worth risking escalation? Do you have a sort of sense of what actually happened there? What were their motives?
I don't buy the idea that this was some sort of an unexpected opportunity and they decided to take it even though it would violate a major Iranian red line and be a major escalation. I think, first of all, the Israelis have been looking for an escalation. If you just take a look at what Gallant, the defense minister, said just a few days before this, he said that we're entering a new phase in which Israel is going to go on the offensive against Hezbollah. So I think this was part of what they had planned to do, because I think a key thing that we have to keep in mind in all of this, which is, again, part of the reason why Biden's strategy has been so problematic, in my view, is that the Israelis, and particularly Netanyahu himself, have not favored de-escalation. He actually wants an escalation. He wants a longer war, and he wants a broader war, because he recognizes that the minute this war ends, not only does his political career end, his prison sentence is likely to begin at that same moment because of the criminal charges that are filed against him. So prolonging the war, expanding the war, serves his interest. And we have to also keep in mind, for more than 20 years, Netanyahu has tried to get the United States to attack Iran militarily. If he elicits a major response from the Iranians, he may have a second bear hug from Biden at a moment in which Biden is, at least rhetorically, starting to put pressure on Netanyahu and the Israeli government. If the Iranians inflict damage on Israel in such a way that it will once again elicit this instinct on the American side to always side with Israel, he may get a second bite at the bear hug apple, so to say, and perhaps even compel the United States to be directly involved in this war against Iran. So the opportunity for a broader war with Iran that could suck the US into it, which is something Netanyahu has been pushing for more than 20 years, he may actually be looking at the best opportunity yet for such an expansion of the war. And this is part of the reason why Biden's approach towards Israel and Gaza has been so problematic, because, and we can go into it in greater detail, but the structure of the negotiations, the demand, the linkage between a ceasefire and the release of the hostages presumes that the Israelis actually prioritize releasing the hostages. And if you ask the Israeli public, you will see a lot of people inside the Israeli public, as well as inside the Israeli government, very vocally criticize the Israeli government right now, the Netanyahu government, for not prioritizing the release of the hostages. Yet Biden's strategy is tied to what Netanyahu wants to do. He's essentially letting Netanyahu take the lead, even though Netanyahu's goals may be very different from those of Biden's.
I mean, this all puts Iran in presumably a very difficult position. If the Israelis are trying to provoke a response which might draw the Americans into an attack on Iran, clearly the Iranians don't want to. I mean, it doesn't seem like they want to start a war with Israel, let alone the United States, right? So they're in this difficult position, and I suppose, is that why we haven't seen a response yet? For me, sort of, if a foreign embassy or a foreign consulate gets bombed and there's no response for 10 days, that seems somewhat surprising. Although I suppose I'm not expert in this kind of thing. Is it normal for a country to wait, over 10 days to retaliate when their territory has been compromised?
There's a reason why it's difficult for us to be able to say whether it's normal or not, because it's completely abnormal for an embassy to be bombed. What the Israelis did is a complete and flagrant violation of the Vienna Convention. This just simply does not happen. So now that it's happened, of course, we're seeing that some sort of a response will likely come from the Iranians. They have absorbed a lot of other hits before without doing much, which has been criticized by hardliners inside of Iran who believe that this has weakened Iran's deterrence. The Mexican embassy was attacked by the Ecuadorians just a couple of days later, and the Mexicans immediately filed a complaint at the ICJ. And of course, the situation between them is different, so a military response was obviously never in the cards. but they responded rather fast. The Iranians have made it very clear that what's important to them is that there will be a response, that it will be the right response rather than that it will be a hasty response. But having said that, I think it should be quite clear there are tensions inside the Iranian regime in which a lot of hardliners essentially are saying the only reason why the Israelis could do this is precisely because the Iranians didn't respond to so many other things that Israel had done in attacking Iran before. And as a result, the Israelis just kept on moving forward, and that they will continue to do so until there is some sort of a response that restores a degree of deterrence. It's the very same logic the Biden administration used when they decided to go and use a significant amount of kinetic force against the Houthis and Iraqi militias after 3 American soldiers were killed at that air base in Jordan.
Is there a scenario where this sort of risky game backfires and sort of Netanyahu provokes a war with the Iranians? The Iranians do, respond. They say we've got no choice but to escalate now. Or maybe there are parts of the regime that do want to escalate. And then the Americans say, actually, you're on your own. And then that would be presumably somewhat of a disaster for the Israelis if they've opened up a new front but don't have any more backing from the United States. Is that remotely possible?
I do think it's possible. I think the Israelis, given how Biden has been so deferential to the Israelis for the last 6 months, and even earlier on throughout his entire presidency, this is part of the reason why the JCPOA was now revived, may believe that that scenario is very, very unlikely. I'm not so sure that it is that unlikely, because if this ends up actually dragging the US into a war that 3 American presidents have actually tried to avoid, actually 4, despite the fact that many of them have been very hawkish, this will go extremely badly with the American populace, including Biden's own base, who he already has tremendous tensions with right now, particularly the Gen Z and the younger components of that base, as well as African American voters. If Biden, because of this unstrategic, unwise, foolish deference to Netanyahu, actually gets the US dragged into a war, a major regional war with Iran, that will be the end of Biden's presidency. Whether he will wake up to it or not, of course, is a different story, mindful of the fact that he hasn't really woken up to how much damage he has done himself to his own re-election bid and to America's standing in the world with his ridiculous and really indefensible defense and support for Israel throughout all of these 6 months.